important that, because we are talking about DRE, something very important that needs to be put on the table is the tracking, the accountability of green projects, because DFIs will always push to have some exposure in green fields for SMEs, but what we tend to forget when it comes to SMEs is this KPI tracking. And the SMEs don't have the know-how to track the KPIs when it comes to green projects. So what AGF is doing differently on this specific challenge is to work on some technical assistance to have an expert, a technical expert outside the PFI and outside the SME to track these indicators and demonstrate that the financing which is being sent to SMEs is really helping to achieve the goal. So this is the main thing that we have been working on internally in terms of technical assistance, which is very important to give a kind of assurance to the DFIs, to all the donors, that your resources that you are routing to the green field is being used properly.
Thank you, Constance. Now I'd like to hear from Rensha von Tonder, who is, as I said, head of renewable energy and power and infrastructure at Standard Bank. Rensha, as Africa's largest bank, Standard Bank is an important leader in financing energy access and the energy transition. What is Standard Bank doing differently to expand financing, and what would you like to see more of from guarantee providers?
Thanks. Sorry, it seems like... Can you hear me now? Perfect. So, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. I think it's an important question, and maybe just for clarity, many of you may not know Standard Bank per se, but we also operate in some countries as Stanbic Bank, like in Tanzania. So for us, it's more about a partnership opportunity. Our clients range from smaller scale clients in the SME sector up to large scale projects. And we focus mostly at the moment in Africa around energy access, linking that into larger scale projects. When we look at the different type of opportunities, and this is where commercial banks are to a certain extent critical, but also important to partner with DFIs and guarantee providers. I believe that you can leverage what we can do as a commercial bank 3, 4, 5 times if you find the right balance in terms of the type of guarantees and the need that is out there. We look at, for example, when you look at solar home systems versus mini-grids versus IPPs selling into utilities versus what we see now being developed in the continent, traders, aggregation, the need for the type of finance and the risk allocation very different. So, for example, when you look at the solar home system, we've done some of these portfolio plays, specifically in Kenya, and our role was very limited to local currency finance in country through the balance sheet that we do have available, supporting the DFIs at that point in time. However, it hasn't been that significant in terms of scaling up the rollout and financing of that play. And I think that's where we need to work smartly. When you look at mini-grids, we haven't done much. And I think part of the challenge really is around how do you address payment risk? How do you address the ability where you don't have a cornerstone off-taker and find that commercial bankability around that? I don't want to discuss too much around IPPs because I think the ones that has been very successful, there has been really good support from the risk providers and guarantee partnerships between banks like ourselves. And I think what we need to do there is probably find that balance between how do we get more bankable projects into that pipeline, because there's so many opportunities. We find that sometimes it's a stop-start and you end up trying to address a risk that a developer or a sponsor should take that a commercial bank shouldn't take. The one part that I do see where we see more and more development, and Maybe it's as we see a liberalized market being adopted through an open market system in the markets we operate, with South Africa, Namibia, Zambia and Kenya being the leaders, is where we introduce traders. And I think a good example is how do we find the right risk allocation and be able to fund that with the right partners. We've recently closed a transaction in Zambia with Africa Green Co, and we didn't have any risk mitigation in terms of a guarantee structure, but we had the ability to finance that to be able to fast track the business case around something like a trader. What we've also done, and we're busy with some of those transactions in South Africa, is where we have the introduction of traders, and the need is very different. You need a first loss, you need a liquidity buffer, you need risk mitigation through a whole different range of risk parameters. And I think what I would like to see more of is closer alignment in terms of those specific needs and how do we address those risks.
Thank you, Rensha. And I have to say, the insights you're sharing of the role that guarantees play in mobilizing private investment resonate with me from a MIGA perspective. You may know, and many of you may know, that President Banga called for the creation of a World Bank Group platform that brings together all of the guarantee products and guarantee experts within the World Bank Group under one umbrella. The purpose of which was two or threefold. One, just to make it simpler to navigate the system, the World Bank Group system. So you had one-stop shop for all guarantees. You would know where to go and you would be coming to MIGA. But also to streamline the execution and diligence process and to make it more or less uniform across the World Bank Group, irrespective of whether or not it's a bank guarantee, an IFC guarantee, or a MIGA guarantee, the three institutions that fall under the MIGA umbrella. But for me, I think the most important aspect of this guarantee platform is our ability now to bring various guarantee products together, right? So we've done it in the past, it was much more ad hoc, but now we can bring our non-commercial risk guarantees together with credit risk guarantees in support of a project and do that systematically. And I think what we'll find is that we're able to grow the pie of projects that we do by virtue of that combination. But also bringing the experts under one roof allows us to start thinking about innovation, right? So we're now in the throes of thinking through providing a portfolio cover. You know, many of you know that MIGA historically provides its cover on a project-by-project basis, and we've been very good at that and very successful at that. We've had a number of investors come to say to us, listen, I have a portfolio of projects. Can you provide a cover for that entire portfolio? And if you do, that will help me do more. So we're thinking, you know, do we know how to identify the risk, manage that risk, price that risk, and we think we will be able to do that in relatively short order. And then, of course, we're also thinking about the application of liquidity solutions and payment guarantees and approaches to mitigate what we've seen in many projects, which is the regulatory uncertainty, what that results in terms of liquidity. And then we have the benefit of blending. We have the IDA PSW, so the private sector window under IDA, which we use to actually manage the cost of our guarantees. But we also have a couple of trust funds, one supported by the Japanese and Norwegians for renewable energy that we use to actually bring down the price of our guarantees. And then finally, we also have a trust fund to help with the technical assistance around much of what needs to be managed in a project around environmental and social issues and integrity issues. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to do one more round of questions to hear from each of you what you think the biggest challenge is in scaling financing towards energy access and how you plan to address that challenge from your perspective. And maybe this time around we'll go in the other order and we'll start with you, Rensha.
Thanks. I think it has been said quite a lot today, and I want to emphasize it again. If we got clear policies accepted and adopted with a commitment from governments to be able to fast track that and execute, we will have more bankable projects and more appetite to fund. And I think we as lenders are certainly key to be able to address that, and we're keen to do that.
Thank you. Chinua?
Yeah, so, when we take an asset class like the DRE, which is estimated to be a pathway to electrifying most Africans that are unserved today, what we find is that we need to understand bankability from resource standpoint in terms of, working backwards to understanding what lenders want, but also knowledge exchange and building capacity to ensure that those are built integrated into as tools into how projects are prepared. I think that knowledge exchange can be replicated and expanded, so you don't have to essentially go through the same whole cycle that it will take. For example, in Nigeria, if we've proven that you could standardize through these models and enable aggregation and scale. And this is what we're doing, at InfraCredit, sort of using these tools to develop standards and processes that can help the development cycle of projects to come in a form that lenders are willing to support. And I believe that through this approach, we can leverage the other support system that could come from for the technical assistance or for the form of blending, but that we can replicate these solutions across other markets, because it's really the same pain points that developers are struggling with across the continent when it comes to these business model and asset class.
Thank you, Chinua. Constance, you get the last word.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So for me, the main challenge is what you rightly describe within the bank. Because you mentioned that within the bank, what you have been trying to do is to put everything on the same platform and make sure that it is deployed on an optimal manner. So this is a work you have been doing very well within the bank. But from where we are sitting as another player, we think that if we want to be optimal or efficient in deploying these resources to the private sector, we need to have this one team, not within the World Bank or the African Development Bank, but across all players. Make sure that if there is one solution which is already being deployed by one player, this player has to deploy this solution and not start having many players deploying the same solution. We talk about guarantee. We have to identify which is the proper guarantee fund in this sector to deploy this activity. We are talking about technical assistance. We need to find the right player to deploy the technical assistance and so on. And by doing that, we know that we are talking with one voice and will be more optimal to deploy the resources.
Thank you, Constance. So for me, 2 or 3 takeaways from this conversation. One around project preparation, and the role that standardization of documents can play when it comes to facilitating project preparation and bankability of projects. Also, another takeaway is the role that guarantees can play in what I call the demonstration effect. So, you support a project with a guarantee, and if that project proves to be successful, it may make the guarantee unnecessary in the future. Indeed, I expect it would. And you have players that are then able to access the markets, capital markets, more easily, having demonstrated by virtue of the support we provided them with a guarantee that they're worth the bet. Another takeaway on guarantees as a complement to what I will call asset-based lending, based on what you were saying, Constant, right? Where collateral tends to play a big role in the decisions that banks make and whether or not to lend. With a guarantee, you might be able to actually compensate for the inability to provide collateral, and again, use that as a means of doing lending slightly differently than has been traditionally the case. My final takeaway is the importance of collaboration. We've had a conversation in the back, and you've heard it here. We think it's very important that we grow the pie of development projects and not compete with one another over the existing pie of projects, right? And as Constant was saying, and I think my other colleagues were saying, figuring out what the right division of labor is amongst us, right? Who's best placed to take on a particular aspect of a project, and have that entity, organization, take on that role and find a complementary role to play. I think collaboration is going to be far better for growing the pie of development projects as opposed to competition. But with that, if you could give a round of applause to our panelists. And I think we've gained 5 minutes of time. So with that, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can do a better round of applause. I know it is late in the afternoon, but that was a riveting conversation. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I do see that there is a request for a photo. I think that photo has been taken. All is well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. We have just one final rapid panel discussion that is left to go on our program, after which we are going to hear some closing comments from Dr. Kafulila, who of course is the Executive Director for Public-Private Partnerships in the Ministry of Finance here in Tanzania. But before we get there, the final conversation is set to really then zoom in on private sector participation in transmission. Now, I want to do a quick check in the room to see if my panelists are with me. The moderator of the session is Mutale Mukuka. Mr. Mutale Mukuka, let me have it. Are you in the room with us? Thank you very much. He's here. He is the CFO, rather, of the Copperbelt Energy Corporation, CEC. Joining him on stage is Chris Flavin, the acting CEO of Gridworks. Chris, thank you so much for being here. And closing up the panel is John Mativo. John, welcome. And John is the Managing Director and CEO of Ketraco. So I have two gentlemen on stage, and I believe that our third gentleman will be joining us shortly. And he'll be joining us on stage. Thank you very much. So we're all complete. Mr. Mukuka, I'm going to hand over the floor to you. You have the hardest job today with the final panel of the afternoon, but I don't doubt that it's going to be a robust conversation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I guess it's evening now. Good evening, everyone. So,
good evening.
We've got an easy one here. I've got experts to help unpack the topic that we have. I think half the time in the sector, we have a small subsector, which is the transmission segment, which is highly neglected from an investment perspective, from a regulatory perspective. And more often than not, we see that this subsector is often seen to be a public sector-led type investments in there. However, over the last couple of years, a number of initiatives have allowed this subsector to change or transform in its own. So what you see is that whether you're looking at it from a west, east, or SAP perspective, you see that there are regional groupings that are coming up with utilities forming their associations, and that in itself is putting pressure on integration of transmission grids of the respective countries. The second issue is that there is a push for the integration of intermittent supply, which is the renewables, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, and so on. Now, that in itself, again, from a technical perspective, investment perspective, requires a different form of and aggressive investment. But coupled with that, one of the challenges is that this sector is seen to be public-driven, and therefore, half the time, ourselves, the consumers, see this as a public good, and therefore do not want to pay a commensurate tariff that is there. We also have, in the respective countries, we have currency mismatch with the borrowing currencies that are there. But we also have not seen a lot of private sector injection of financing. Now, with a target of 300 million people that we need to connect, it means that we need to allow for private sector financing to come in and essentially go alongside the public financing that is there to activate some of these interconnections that are there with the regional interconnection, as well as the new build. And to have this conversation, I've got Chris and John, who are experts in this field. Chris is the CEO of GridWorks. I've got John. John is the CEO of Ketraco. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Mitali. Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Okay. Sure. So the first question, maybe I'll push it to John. John, what is the role of the private sector in transmission? Do you see the private sector having more of a role now that we need to spend so much money in transmission, in infrastructure, and how do you see it playing out? How can they participate?
Thank you for that. First, let me appreciate the host, Tanzania, for this opportunity. And specifically, I want to speak out to my brothers and sisters in TANESCO. In December, we energized the Kenya-Tanzania interconnectors. So Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania are connected, actually the same harmonized frequency. So we are interconnected, so that's something to celebrate. But back to your question, mission 300 million. It's a big one. What is the space there? I was just doing quick mathematics, breaking down the work there, then I'll come back to Kenya in terms of opportunities. Basically, the world has 8 billion people, 7 million kilometers of transmission line, 110 kilometers of distribution lines. Use the same ratio with Africa expecting to connect 300 million people. You're basically talking about close to 4 million kilometers of distribution lines that need to be put in place and almost 250,000 kilometers of transmission. So there's a lot of work to be done. But even if you assume that half the people will be served either using solar, isolated off-grid solutions, or if it's densification of existing transformers, you're basically talking about anything close to 2 million kilometers of distribution and anything like 150 kilometers of transmission. Now, looking at those numbers, for those of us who don't know the number of transmission lines in sub-Saharan Africa, that's close to what we have. So there's a lot of work to be done to get the infrastructure that needs to meet this target, and you only have, let me say, 6 years to meet the targets. So let me look at Ketraco's perspective, and I believe most African countries, as the moderator said, transmission infrastructure has been basically the national government borrowing from development partners, utility company like Ketraco, bring projects that can actually bring benefits that can be accrued at the public in the end, whether there is a tariff increase. But when you look at it in terms of reduction in terms of losses or increasing of consumption, which goes back to increasing sales, there's a benefit at the end. So that's the direction we're going. Private sector coming on board. In Kenya, I believe for Africa to meet these targets, there's no way the model of government borrowing can work alone. It has to be a joint partnership with the private sector. Thank you, moderator.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, John. Coming to you, Chris, you are playing in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. I guess you've seen that some countries have made reforms. Some countries are better today than others. Some regional associations are better than others. Could you just give us some insight as to what you're seeing on the continent? Which countries and which regions are favored today based on where they are? What would you want to see different in those countries that are lagging behind in terms of investment in transmission?
Sure. So, look, first of all, I want to say that I think it's possible to do private sector transmission projects in most countries on the continent. I think there's often a lot of discussion about creating enabling environments and creating transmission regulations and so on and so forth. This is very important work, but most countries on the continent have an Electricity Act and or a PPP Act that are at least permissive of private sector investment. So this can work most places, particularly most countries that have already used private capital in the generation sector, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We have bankable structures, implementation agreements, government support arrangements that work for the generation sector that can also be used for the transmission sector. Now that said, there are clearly countries that have made more progress in this area in the last 4 or 5 years, which is the period of time in which GridWorks has been established. When GridWorks was established in 2019, there were, I think, probably only a couple of countries, maybe 2 or 3 on the continent, who had made a sort of a public policy decision to use private sector capital in the mix to fund transmission. One of them was Uganda, where we're in the process of having a transmission project licensed at the moment at GridWorks. Another was Kenya, where John has been working with the private sector on some projects there which will serve as pilots. We're also seeing some material developments in the SAP region at the moment. GridWorks is working on the Chimura-Nakala project, which is just under 500 kilometres of 400 kV line and associated substations. This is a very material, privately financed project that will reinforce the connection between the central grid in Mozambique and the north. And, I mean, Mutali, the market that you are focused on, Zambia, is a very dynamic market at the moment. There's a lot going on there. And clearly South Africa is planning a programmatic approach to transmission as well, and will try and replicate the benefits of the REAP process there for renewables in the transmission space. So we are seeing a lot of countries really focusing on this. Morocco deserves a mention as well. There's a large HVDC project under development there. And there's a growing trend because, as John said, governments can't continue to carry the cost of developing this sector on their balance sheets. It's a very material cost, and there isn't sufficient headroom to do this any other way. So, look, it's a very dynamic market at the moment, and we think this is going to be a very material growth area. It's certainly something that GridWorks is focusing on at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. I guess going back to you, John, looking at it from a government and utilities perspective, what do you see as being the sort of opportunities and benefits of them introducing private sector financing in the respective countries to fund the transmission infrastructure?
I guess one of the benefits I could just run with is maybe two main benefits because of time. One of them is definitely the ability for government to run everything else at balance sheet, which I've said. This helps me to meet our targets in terms of transmission master plan, meet all the targets that we're coming to. But I want to stress more in terms of the efficiency that private sector needs to bring on board and should be bring on board based on the PPP Act. So basically, whether it's time efficiency, technology efficiency, to be able to ensure that projects, and again, ensure these projects accrue benefits that can actually be felt by the public faster than it should be. Let me give a good example, whether we talk about the Kenya-Ethiopia line, which, because of various reasons, especially government financing, we finished anything between 4 and 5 years later than expected, than what was the initial EPC timeline. Thinking about if we had private sector who could take the project, and you see how much savings Kenya is getting in terms of, because of buying cheaper power from Ethiopia, we are making actually cost of power in Kenya is cheaper because of that additional benefit that comes into that. So efficiency from private sector, and I'll just pick one example, finishing projects on time, they're supposed to, otherwise they don't get paid for it because it's performance-based payment is one of the best benefits that comes to the whole thing. So helps the government make quick decisions, helps me meet my targets, and again, the efficiency that comes on board. So briefly, I'll say that.
Thank you. So, Chris, I guess coming back to you, if we look at the landscape, right, one of the key issues is what sort of models can be used by the private sector to invest their capital in ITP. Now, what do you see as the key challenges as it relates to regulation and some of the financing sort of risks that you see, whether it's the cost of capital, the structuring, the risk allocation, and how can we overcome those based on the models that you've seen operating in the continent?
So I'll go back to how I started my previous answer, that a lot of the thinking on this can be replicated from the IPP sector if we are moving ahead with sort of narrow PPPs, ITPs, IPTs, whatever you want to call them. You have a simple offtake agreement with the utility, and you have some government support arrangements. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel with this. There are risk mitigation tools available already for other forms of infrastructure in Africa, including liquidity support instruments from people like ATIDI, political risk insurance. I see the MEGA team sitting in the room. You know, we've got standard practice in all of these markets on government support arrangements. So the experience of GridWorks so far has been that when we get projects towards financial close, there is no lack of capital that's very interested in financing them. We have long-term debt and long-term equity available for infrastructure projects in Africa. The gap that we see is at the front end. It's project development. It's risk capital to develop projects. Transmission is very capital intensive, but developing transmission projects is very expensive as well. Projects, sort of, you know, $300 or $400 million projects cost $10 to $15 million to develop, and there isn't a lot of suitable funding available to cover that. A lot of the sort of development facilities that are available for the African energy sector at the moment were designed around sort of smaller scale renewables projects. So they don't really fit larger projects like this. So I think that's the key area, and that's where the development finance community, I think, could focus more resources to unlock more of these projects.
Thank you. I guess we have a few minutes to go. Maybe we can have one question each. And coming back to you, John, maybe you might want to just give a highlight of how we can enhance collaboration between the private sector and public sector. You know, what are the three things that should be taken into account to build stronger partnership between the governments, the utilities, the regulators, and the private sector who are injecting capital in these projects?
Thank you. I think once a country has developed the right PPP framework, especially regulations and the Act and all guidelines that are there, then whether it's the Energy Act, for example, in Kenya, but I believe in other places, has a framework in terms of onboarding private sector players to come on board. So the Act, the laws are very clear in terms of how private player comes on board. I think the next thing is to focus in terms of how do we get especially the government side to have the capacities and the skills that are necessary. And here people have to work together. The other one is to develop documents, because one of the things right now, preparing project agreement with Africa 50, and it's taken longer to develop the whole thing. And if there's a way to have standardized documents, will make things much faster to move forward. Then the whole issue in terms of being able to, because the biggest risk in terms of transmission line, one of them is definitely the issue of right of way, the way leaves. If we can find a solution in terms of how they can be got early and acquired, even if it's going to be paid through the project later, but at least that ensures that is taken care of. Issues of liquidated payments, liquidated support to ensure there is in the utility companies that especially are collecting money from the consumers, they have enough resources to be able to pay. I know that's one of the debates. I know there is a TD and MEGA we talked about. I think we're still debating in terms of how to have either 2 months worth of payment available, some cash support. So basically seen in terms of how government, private sector and development partners can come and ensure that at least the first set of PPP projects in Africa transmission lines will be made easier to develop as we go forward. Then the other thing is definitely how do we communicate this information to the public? That they're critical factors. It's not well handled. This is something that Africa, most people are still have not absorbed what a private sector player will be doing in transmission infrastructure. So that's something that we can work on, I believe, all of us together, and make it much easier to implement future projects. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick one for you, Chris. Innovation is a key word in anything. How can we be innovative? How can we think outside the box from a financing perspective? And what financial instruments are out there for the investors who are here? What should they look at? Should they just limit themselves to the traditional financing that we see? Or are there other instruments that they should be looking at to finance transmission infrastructure? under 1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes. I'll try and be very quick. I'm not sure if this is innovation because it's probably going back to the tried and tested from other markets. In most places in the world where major grid extensions, major grid projects have happened, in places that have close to 100% access now in Europe and North America, a lot of the heavy lifting was done by governments and then a lot of the time by PPPs, so governments in coordination with the private sector. In Africa at the moment, we seem to be trying these two polar opposite models. You've got the tried and tested public sector financing routes, loans from MDBs, government resources, and then some projects, a small number of projects, they're sort of tossed to the private sector and they say, sort of have at it and see if you can do this without any subsidy. The very obvious way to do this is for the scarce public sector funding that requires government support to be spread around a number of projects to deal with viability gaps in them and then to leverage private finance so that if there's $100 million available, $200 million, instead of doing one project of concessionary money, instead of doing one project, you use it to deal with a viability gap on 7 or 8 projects that are then funded with the private sector. I think that's the way to do the big heavy lift on the continent. The trick is going to be how you do this with the appropriate governance and the appropriate process from a procurement perspective when you're using this sort of public funding, because there's a risk that it could take a very long time to do these things programmatically.
Thank you, gentlemen. I guess a quick summary there is that we need the private sector financing in transmission. We need, from a government perspective, to ensure that we put in place the right framework from a regulatory perspective. We need to have the right ahead risk allocation between the investors, the government, and the utilities. There is no way that we are going to achieve the 300 million access to electricity if we do not find a way of attracting private sector financing in transmission as well. More importantly, I think we need to ensure that we have reliable transmission networks that will allow for the supply of reliable and efficient power. But we need to be ready to support the transition, energy transition that is there. With that, please allow. You can clap for my experts here. I think they've done a good job. We've got John and Chris. This is the last session, I guess. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll invite there you are. Thank you.
Oui, je suis là également pour vous remercier d'avoir partagé vos points de vue durant ce panel. Thank you very much. Il est à présent temps de conclure cette journée. Et pour ce faire, nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir Monsieur David Kafulila, directeur exécutif des partenariats publics-privés au ministère des Finances de la République de Tanzanie. Un grand merci, mesdames et messieurs, effectivement, à nos panélistes et à notre modérateur.
Good evening. Yes, distinguished panelists, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it is my pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to address this very strategic conference after having almost all the sessions for today. Mine is just to summarize and, of course, to put things together according to what we have been discussing, either from the perspective of panelists, but also from the general observation. As an executive director for public-private partnership, I have something to share. First of all, the Mission 300 is not just and it should not be just a goal, but it has to be something to have in action. But again, this kind of ambitious projection of creating access to electricity for more than around 300 million people, it needs very strategic interventions. But from the perspective of panelists, you can all agree that achieving this ambitious goal takes more than government alone to strategize and achieve. So it is from that perspective that the panelists who have been discussing issues around power transmission line by using private sector have concluded that it is inevitable. I mean, private sector engagement is inevitable, that we must engage private sector to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal and making this dream sustainable, practical, and achievable. This can be noted from the numbers and the size of our economies as a continent. For instance, to date, according to IMF data, the ratio of debt to GDP for Tanzania is around 47%. For Kenya is around 70%. Rwanda 71%. Malawi is around 84%. The whole continent of Africa is subjected to debt distress. The ratio of the GDP of the whole continent to debt to GDP of the whole continent is around 67%. So this calls for more alternative financing to achieve such strategic projects like power transmission. So in a nutshell, we need to align almost every stakeholders, every players in making sure that we mobilize the resources to implement such massive investment in power transmission and of course even generation. Because when we are talking access to electricity, we are talking about increasing generation, but also increasing transmission, increasing connectivity. So in order to achieve this ambitious goal, we need to align with all players. And there are multiple players because there are multiple interventions. I mean, resolving issues around power transmission, generation, involve multiple interventions from generation, from project planning to the project execution, from transmission to generation, generation to transmission. So there are multiple players involved. We need government to align with the private sector interests. We need the government and the private sector to align with the lenders' interests. We need the government, lenders, and private sector to align with the civil society interests. Because it is the role of civil society to make sure that the general society in Africa achieve equity and inclusive energy access. So we need connectivity to around 300 million people, but this connectivity must go together with inclusiveness. So we need to make sure that we strategize in a way that all the players, from financials, civil society, private sector, all are aligned to make sure that we achieve this ambitious goal. Because one of the critical challenges that we are facing is misalignment among the key players. So in doing so, we need to undertake some major reforms in making sure that the policy and legal and regulatory frameworks are in line with the interest of those key and major players. In Tanzania, for instance, we amended our law, the PPP Act, in 2023. And the Act now is providing some key elements to make sure that we have the framework which is competitive, to make sure that no investor can fail to decide investing simply because of the weakness in our framework. Our framework provides government guarantees. Our framework provides viability gap funding, that in case maybe the project is not commercially viable but economically is viable, the law provides viability gap funding to support investors. But the law provides room for international arbitrations, which was not there before the amendment. And the law provides establishment of special purpose vehicle for the sake of transparency and accountability. So after having done all these amendments in our legal framework, we have seen the mushrooming of investors' interest to invest in our country, especially in this sector. Why? It's because of the friendly and competitive legal and regulatory framework. The only challenge so far, which we are trying to address, and this has been, and this is in the desk of TANESCO, is an issue of making alignment between the Energy Act, which limits private sector to undertake transmission. So we hope that soon we'll amend the Act to allow private investor to undertake, to be engaged in power transmission. So, ladies and gentlemen, this ambition of 300 million people connected by 2030, it should be not, we must make it not a goal to achieve in 5 years, but we have to put action plan in place to make sure that we achieve systematically, step by step, and each country is assessed according to what we have agreed. Maybe by making this one, we can achieve this ambitious goal in a holistic manner. Because some countries might achieve, while some countries might be left behind, which is not the case, which is not the target of this conference. The purpose of this conference is to make sure that as a continent, we grow together. As a continent, we achieve this ambitious goal together. It is practical, it is possible, but it needs strategies, it needs establishment of mechanisms to make sure that we get it done in a framework, in the time provided, which is 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists, the way forward is so clear that we need to harmonize the efforts. By harmonization of efforts, it means to harmonize efforts of all actors, all players. We have to harmonize the efforts of lenders, private companies, government institutions, utility institutions, of course, the whole government in general. We have to harmonize the civil society efforts. We have to harmonize all the key players' interests and focus to make sure that we achieve the bankable projects. We achieve the projects which can make this continent achieving what we have decided by 2030, which is connecting around 300 million people by 2030. But again, we need to mobilize catalytic funding, because one of the challenges we are facing as a continent is project preparation. But through catalytic fund, we can access funds for project preparations. In PPP, for instance, it is estimated that the project cost around 2% of the, preparation cost around 3 to 5% of the project cost. So this means if you are targeting to mobilize, for instance, $9 billion PPP projects like what we are planning as a nation, as Tanzania, it means you need more than 480 million in 5 years to attain such ambitious goal. So given the pressure in our balance sheet, in so many countries, as I've just mentioned for a few, on the ratio of debt to GDP. Given the ratio of debt to GDP as a continent which is at more than 67%, it means we need some interventions, especially by achieving funds from either blended financing model or institutional investors or any kind of catalytic funds to make sure that we achieve this strategic goal. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my hope that your stay from the morning to this evening has made a great change in your mind. You are not the way you entered during the morning. Thank you and have a good evening.
A very big thank you to Mr. David Kafulila as he gives us his closing remarks and reminds us that the way forward is so clear. Thank you for the reminder that it is going to take coordination and harmonization, strategies, and more importantly, sir, it's going to take action. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we close, allow me just to make a few logistical announcements in relation to our dinner plans this evening. We are going to be invited, and we are all invited to the reception, which starts at 1900 hours. The reception is taking place at the exact same place where we had lunch earlier on today, and that starts from 1900 hours. And then, more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, the starting time for tomorrow. Now, remembering that tomorrow we have our heads of state in presence, and as a result, access and security is going to be a lot tighter and a lot more robust. And so we're inviting all our delegates to, firstly, make sure that you are seated by 8 a.m. at the very latest. We will be serving coffee and enabling networking from as early as 6:30. So you can come from as early as 6:30, but by 8 a.m. we request that everybody is seated so that we might receive our heads of state. Anybody who tries to access this venue after 8 will unfortunately not make it in. And so we want to make sure that everybody gets this message so that they can be a part of our conversations tomorrow. The final thing that I'm going to say before I hand over to Marie-Angèle, where she's going to give us a little flyover over the program tomorrow, is to thank you very much for those who are in the room. Thank you for staying in the room throughout the day, but also for everybody who's joining us online. Thank you for remaining connected with us and being a part of our conversation. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's been an absolute privilege. Marie-Angèle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nozipho. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, effectivement, comme Nozipho l'a précisé, moi je vais vous faire un avant-goût de la journée de demain. Ça sera une journée décisive pour ce sommet sur l'énergie en Afrique. Nous débuterons, comme elle l'a rappelé, par une cérémonie d'ouverture officielle suivie d'interventions de haut niveau de chefs d'État qui seront présents, une vingtaine à peu près, et de leaders internationaux qui partageront leur vision pour l'avenir énergétique du continent africain. Il y aura des panels clés qui aborderont des thèmes essentiels et les chefs d'État présenteront également leurs engagements, parce qu'il y en aura, pour garantir l'accès universel à l'électricité. Alors, la journée sera également marquée par la signature de la déclaration de Dar es Salaam sur l'énergie et enfin, nous conclurons avec des partenariats renforcés et une feuille de route plus claire pour transformer ces ambitions en résultats concrets. Préparez-vous à une journée riche en échanges et en décisions impactantes. Merci à tous une fois de plus pour votre attention, pour votre présence et rendez-vous demain avec tout l'enthousiasme que vous avez eu aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup et je suis sûre que vous êtes très enthousiastes de participer au dîner ce soir. Alors à demain. Merci encore.